The invisible wall. How the VT Fuze shattered the V1 threat. Imagine this. It's the summer of 1944. A week after D-Day, Londoners hear a new sound in the sky. It's not the familiar drone of a bomber or the scream of a fighter. It's a guttural, sputtering roar, like a giant, angry motorcycle ripping through the clouds. This was the sound of the V1, Hitler's vengeance weapon. The British people gave it a nickname that belied its terror: the Doodlebug. This wasn't just another bomb. It was a revolution in warfare. The V1 was the world's first cruise missile, a pilotless jet-powered aircraft packed with nearly a ton of high explosives, designed for one purpose: to bring terror and destruction to the streets of London. What made the V1 so terrifying wasn't just its payload, but its psychological impact. Its pulse jet engine was incredibly loud and distinctive. Day and night, that menacing sound hung over the city, a constant reminder of the threat overhead. You couldn't see it, but you could always hear it coming. And the most frightening moment of all? When the engine suddenly cut out, that's when you knew. The silence meant the Doodlebug had run out of fuel and was now in its final deadly dive. For those few seconds of eerie quiet, everyone on the ground would freeze, praying it wasn't heading for them. The silence was the real sound of death. In those terrifying moments, a square mile of city held its breath, waiting for the inevitable devastating explosion. The V1 was a nightmare for Britain's defenses. It flew too fast for many fighters of the day and too low for traditional anti-aircraft guns to effectively track. A typical anti-aircraft shell used a time delay fuse. Gunners had to calculate the target's speed, altitude, and direction, then set a timer on the shell to explode at a precise moment in the sky. Think about it. You're trying to hit a small, fast-moving object 3 miles up, and your shell has to arrive at the exact same point in three-dimensional space at the exact same time. It was an almost impossible calculation. The slightest error in judging speed or height meant the shell would burst harmlessly in an empty patch of sky. The statistics were grim. At the start of the V1 campaign, it took on average over 2,500 shells just to bring down a single Doodlebug. The defenses were simply not working, and the bombs kept falling. For Hitler, the V1 was more than just a weapon. It was a last, desperate gamble. With Germany losing on both the eastern and western fronts, he believed this new wave of terror could break British morale, disrupt the Allied war effort, and perhaps force a negotiated peace. He envisioned a relentless storm of these missiles, thousands of them, raining down on London day after day, until the city was leveled and its people were broken. He called them Vergeltungswaffen, or vengeance weapons, a direct retaliation for the Allied bombing of German cities. This wasn't a strategic military strike. It was an act of pure terror aimed at civilians. As the V1 South began to pour across the English Channel, it seemed like Hitler's cruel vision might just become a reality. London was facing its darkest hour since the Blitz, and a solution was needed, fast. That solution had been in development for years, in secret, across the Atlantic. It was a piece of technology so advanced, it was considered the second most important secret project of the war, right after the atomic bomb. It was called the Variable Time Fuse, or VT Fuze, but the troops who used it had a better name, the Proximity Fuse. This tiny device, no bigger than a radio tube from that era, was a miniature marvel of engineering. It contained a complete radio transmitter and receiver packed into the nose cone of an anti-aircraft shell. Instead of relying on a timer, this fuse was a tiny self-contained radar system. As the shell flew through the air, it continuously broadcast radio waves. When those waves bounced off a target, like a V1, and returned to the receiver, the fuse would instantly detonate the shell. No more guesswork, no more complex calculations. A direct hit was no longer necessary. As long as the shell passed within about 70 feet of the target, it would explode, sending a lethal cloud of shrapnel into the Doodlebug. The development of the VT Fuze was an incredible scientific and engineering challenge. The components had to be miniaturized to fit inside the tip of a shell. But more than that, they had to be rugged enough to survive the sheer violence of being fired from a cannon. When an anti-aircraft gun fires, the shell is subjected to 20,000 times the force of gravity and is spun at over 25,000 revolutions per minute. Early prototypes were smashed to pieces. The delicate glass vacuum tubes, the batteries, the circuits, everything shattered. Scientists and engineers worked tirelessly, inventing new ruggedized components. They designed special batteries that were activated by the shock of firing and created tiny vacuum tubes that could withstand the immense G-forces. After years of trial and error, they finally succeeded. They had created a brain for the shell, a device that could think for itself and detonate at the perfect moment. It was a game changer, and its first major test was about to come against Hitler's V1 South. Initially, the Allies were hesitant to deploy the VT Fuze over land. It was such a valuable secret that they feared a dud shell might fall into German hands, allowing them to copy the technology. So at first, the fuses were only used by the Navy at sea. But as the V1 attacks on London intensified, the situation became desperate. General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a bold decision. The risk was worth it. The fuses were rushed to the anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the English coast. These gun crews had been struggling for weeks, firing thousands of rounds with little success. They were exhausted and demoralized. Then they were handed these new secret shells. The instructions were simple, just point and shoot. They didn't need to know how it worked, just that it did. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic turnarounds in the air war. The Doodlebugs were about to fly into a wall of fire, unlike anything they had faced before. The results were immediate and staggering. On the very first day, the VT fuses were used in large numbers. The kill rates skyrocketed. Gun crews who had been lucky to hit one V1 a week were now shooting them down one after another. The sky over the English coast became a scrapyard of falling Doodlebugs. The new fuses were 7 times more effective than the old-time fuses. The statistics tell the story. In the first week of the V1 campaign, anti-aircraft guns shot down less than 10% of the missiles that reached England. By the end of August, with the VT Fuze fully deployed, they were shooting down over 60%. The peak of the success came on a single day, August 28, 1944. On that day, 104 V1 South were launched towards London. Of the 97 that crossed the coast, the anti-aircraft batteries, now armed with the proximity fuse, shot down an incredible 79 of them. That's a kill rate of 82% in a single day. The Doodlebug alley on the coast had become an almost impenetrable barrier. The weapon that was supposed to bring London to its knees had been neutered. The impact of the VT Fuze was profound. It didn't just save London from destruction. It saved countless lives. By neutralizing the V1 threat, it allowed the Allied war effort to continue without the massive disruption Hitler had hoped for. The resources and manpower that would have been diverted to deal with the crisis could remain focused on the fight in Europe. American military leaders were in awe. One report stated that the fuse was one of the most important new military devices of the war, and its development served to shorten the war and save many thousands of lives. The Germans were completely baffled. They knew something had changed dramatically, but they couldn't figure out what. Their intelligence reports suggested the Allies had developed a new kind of radar-guided fire control, never suspecting that the secret was hidden inside every single shell flying towards their missiles. The story of the VT Fuze is a testament to the power of innovation in the face of tyranny. While the V1 represented a terrifying new form of indiscriminate warfare, the proximity fuse was a triumph of precision and ingenuity, designed specifically to counter it. It was a hidden hero of World War II, a piece of secret technology that turned the tide in the defense of Britain. The next time you hear about the famous Spitfire pilots who chased down 5-1 South, remember the unsung heroes on the ground, the scientists who built the impossible fuse and the gun crews who used it to create a shield of fire over England. They proved that sometimes the biggest victories come from the smallest packages. The silent victory. Legacy of the proximity fuse. The secret weapon was the American-developed VT Fuze. This little marvel, no bigger than a radio tube, was a miniature radar set packed into the nose of an artillery shell. Instead of relying on a timer, it would detonate automatically when it detected it was close to a target. It didn't need a direct hit. It just needed to get near. This was a revolution in air defense. The Allies had been developing this technology in absolute secrecy, knowing that if the Germans captured it, they could copy it and turn it against Allied bombers. So for years, its use was restricted only to overwater operations, where a dud shell couldn't be recovered by the enemy. But with London on its knees, the decision was made to deploy them to defend the home front. The results were nothing short of miraculous. On a single day, August 28, 1944, anti-aircraft batteries equipped with these new fuses shot down 68 out of 97 V1 South that reached the English coast. Let me repeat that. A staggering 82% of the incoming threats were neutralized in one day by ground-based guns alone. Before the VT Fuze, such a success rate was unthinkable. It was a turning point. The constant drone of the Doodlebugs over London began to fade, not because the Germans stopped launching them, but because they simply couldn't get through the new invisible shield protecting the city. The German high command was baffled. They had no idea how the British defenses had suddenly become so lethally effective. They suspected better radar or improved gunnery, but they never guessed the secret was inside the shells themselves. The morale in London and across Britain saw a massive boost. The VT Fuze saved countless lives and protected the city when it was most vulnerable. But the story of this incredible device doesn't end over the skies of England. As the Allies pushed into Europe after D-Day, General Eisenhower was facing another crisis, the Battle of the Bulge. In the dead of winter, a massive German offensive caught the Allies completely by surprise, creating a dangerous bulge in the front line. The situation was desperate. The American forces were outnumbered, and the weather was so bad that Allied air superiority was neutralized. Ground troops were being pounded by German artillery. It was in this critical moment that the top-secret restriction on the VT Fuze SUs over land was finally lifted. For the first time, this technology would be used not against aircraft, but against ground troops. The effect was devastating and utterly terrifying for the German soldiers. Standard artillery shells with impact fuses would often bury themselves in the mud or snow before exploding, muffling the blast and shrapnel. But the VT Fuze changed the equation entirely. These shells were set to explode in the air, just above the heads of the enemy soldiers. This airburst effect showered the area below with a deadly rain of shrapnel, bypassing foxholes and any shallow cover. German soldiers who thought they were safe in their trenches were suddenly exposed and defenseless. The psychological impact was immense. They described it as Christmas tree shelling because of the flashes in the air. The constant, unavoidable threat from above shattered morale. General George Patton himself said the introduction of the proximity fuse required a complete revision of land warfare tactics and called it the most effective weapon of the war. It played a crucial, if unsung, role in stopping the German advance and helping to win the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans, to the very end, never figured out what was hitting them. So what exactly made this fuse so special? It was essentially the world's first smart munition. Think about it. A self-contained device that could sense its environment and make a decision to detonate at the most effective moment. It contained a tiny radio transmitter and receiver. The transmitter sent out a continuous radio wave, and the receiver listened for the reflection of that wave, bouncing off a nearby target. As the shell got closer to an aircraft or the ground, the reflected signal became stronger. Once the signal reached a certain threshold, a switch was triggered, detonating the shell. All of this had to be built into a device sturdy enough to withstand the immense G-forces of being fired from a cannon, over 20,000 times the force of gravity. It was a staggering feat of engineering, accomplished by a team of scientists under the direction of Dr. Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. They had to invent rugged new vacuum tubes, batteries, and safety mechanisms, all miniaturized to fit inside the tip of a shell. This wasn't just a new type of fuse. It was the birth of microelectronics and smart weaponry. Every guided missile, every smart bomb, every modern air defense system we have today owes its existence to the pioneering work done on the VT Fuze. It is the direct ancestor of the sophisticated military technology that defines modern warfare. Given its incredible impact, why isn't the VT Fuze as famous as the Spitfire, the Sherman tank, or the B-17 bomber? Why is it one of history's great unsung heroes? The primary reason is secrecy. The project was one of the best-kept secrets of the war. The Allies knew that if the Axis powers captured the technology, the strategic advantage would be lost. This secrecy was maintained so effectively that even after the war, its story remained largely in the shadows, overshadowed by the more visible and dramatic stories of battlefield courage and atomic power. Furthermore, its contribution was technical, a force multiplier that made existing weapons better rather than a dramatic new weapon system in itself. It is easier to tell the story of a brave pilot in a dogfight than it is to explain the physics of a miniature radar in an artillery shell. It's a classic example of a black box technology. Its effects were obvious, but its workings were a mystery to almost everyone, including the soldiers using it. The name itself, VT Fuze, which stood for variable time, was a piece of deliberate misdirection to confuse enemy intelligence. Its true nature as a proximity device was hidden even in its name. Looking back, the story of the VT Fuze offers a powerful lesson. In warfare, and in many other fields, the decisive advantage often comes not from bigger explosions or faster planes, but from smarter information. The fuse didn't carry more explosives. It simply knew where and when to use them for maximum effect. It was a victory of intelligence, in both senses of the word. Clever engineering and superior information about the target's location. The Germans had bigger rockets and more advanced jet fighters, but the Allies had a shell that could think for itself. This principle holds true today more than ever. The ability to gather, process, and act upon information faster and more accurately than an opponent is the key to success. The silent, almost forgotten victory of the VT Fuze is a testament to the power of innovation and a reminder that sometimes the smallest components can have the biggest impact on history. It truly was the secret weapon that saved London and helped win the war. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this piece of hidden history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the unsung heroes and forgotten technologies that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what other secret weapons of World War II you'd like to learn about. See you next time. German blindness. Why they never cracked the code. Let's rewind a bit. In the summer of 1944, London was under siege from a new and terrifying weapon, the V-1 flying bomb. These were essentially pilotless jet-propelled aircraft packed with explosives, and they rained down on the city, causing widespread destruction and panic. The British scrambled to find a defense. Fighter planes were effective, but risky. Barrage balloons helped, but the V-1s could fly around them. The last line of defense was anti-aircraft artillery. Initially, the gun crews faced a monumental task. The V-1 South were small, fast targets, flying at around 400 miles per hour. Hitting one required incredible precision. Gunners had to use time-fused shells, which meant they had to calculate the exact moment to detonate the shell in the V-1's path. A fraction of a second too early or too late, and the shell would miss. The early success rates were low, really low, sometimes less than 10%. It was a frustrating and often futile effort. But then, something changed, dramatically. Suddenly, British and American gun batteries started knocking V-1 South out of the sky with astonishing regularity. German commanders back in France were baffled. They saw their wonder weapons being destroyed in mid-air, but their intelligence reports couldn't explain how. They were getting reports from their agents in Britain, but none of them mentioned a new type of weapon. The Allied gun emplacements looked the same. The guns were the same. The shells seemed the same. So what were the Germans thinking? Some of their commanders speculated it was just sheer luck, or that Allied gunners had somehow achieved a superhuman level of skill and coordination. Others wondered if the Allies had developed a new, highly advanced radar system that could guide shells with pinpoint accuracy. They were grasping at straws, trying to solve a puzzle with a crucial piece missing. The real answer was something they couldn't even comprehend. It was a piece of American ingenuity, a miniature radio station packed into the nose of an artillery shell. This was the VT Fuze, with VT standing for variable time. Each fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter and receiver. As the shell flew through the air, it broadcast a radio signal. When the shell got close to a target, like a V1, the radio waves would bounce back and be picked up by the receiver in the fuse. Once the reflected signal reached a certain strength, indicating the shell was close enough to do damage, it would trigger the detonator. Boom! The shell exploded right next to the target, no direct hit required. Think about how revolutionary this was. It took all the guesswork out of timing. Gunners no longer needed to predict the future. They just had to get the shell into the general vicinity of the target, and the fuse would do the rest. It was like giving every single shell its own tiny brain and eyes. The Germans were completely blind to this. A huge part of this was a massive intelligence gap. They consistently underestimated American and British technological capabilities, especially in electronics. German engineering was world-class, but they were often overconfident, believing their own technology was unbeatable. The idea that the Allies, particularly the Americans, could mass-produce a complex, delicate electronic device like a vacuum tube, small and rugged enough to survive being fired from a cannon, was, to them, almost unthinkable. The forces inside a gun barrel are immense, over 20,000 times the force of gravity. Creating vacuum tubes that wouldn't shatter under that pressure was a monumental engineering feat, one the Germans simply didn't believe their enemies had solved. This led to some strange theories on the German side. Pilots and ground observers reported seeing V1 South mysteriously exploding in midair, without any visible trace of being hit by a shell. They called them ghost explosions. Since they couldn't see any shrapnel or tracer fire connecting with the V1, they came up with all sorts of explanations. Maybe it was a new kind of invisible energy beam, or perhaps some kind of acoustic weapon that used sound waves to detonate the V1's warhead. They even considered that the Allies were somehow jamming the V1's guidance system, causing it to self-destruct. The truth was far simpler and far more effective. The explosions were caused by the shrapnel from VT Fuze shells detonating nearby. The Allies, of course, knew they were sitting on a game-changing secret, and they went to extraordinary lengths to protect it. The biggest fear was that a dud shell, one with an unexploded VT Fuze, would land in German-held territory. If German scientists got their hands on one and reverse-engineered it, the advantage would be lost. This was a top-tier military secret, on par with the atomic bomb project. For this reason, the use of VT fuses was strictly forbidden over land where they might be recovered by the enemy. For a long time, they were only used by the Navy at sea, where any duds would sink harmlessly to the ocean floor. But the V1 threat to London was so severe that a calculated risk was taken. General Eisenhower authorized their use against the flying bombs, but only over British soil. This created a new, bizarre mission for Allied troops and even civilians. Whenever a VT fused shell was fired and didn't explode, teams were scrambled to find the debris. Special search parties were organized to scour the fields and marshes of southern England, looking for these unexploded fuses. It was a race against time and against German espionage. They had to recover every single one before a German agent could. The cover story was that they were searching for a new type of experimental German weapon, a clever piece of misdirection to throw spies off the scent. This meticulous effort to maintain secrecy paid off. The Germans remained in the dark for the entire V1 campaign. They continued launching their flying bombs, and the Allies continued shooting them down in ever-increasing numbers. The psychological effect on the German command was devastating. Their wonder weapon was being neutralized, and they had no idea why. Their confidence was shattered. The cost of their overconfidence was immense. By believing their own engineering was superior and underestimating their opponents, they failed to even look in the right direction for an explanation. They were so focused on mechanical and chemical solutions that the possibility of a sophisticated electronic answer never seriously entered their minds. It's a classic case of how arrogance and a failure of imagination can lead to strategic blindness. Eventually, the secret did come out. After the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and overran the V1 launch sites in France, the threat to Britain ended. The VT Fuze was then cleared for general use in land combat, and it proved just as devastating against German ground troops. During the Battle of the Bulge, VT fused artillery shells exploding in the air above German soldiers caught in the open had a terrifying and demoralizing effect. It was then that the Germans finally captured some fragments and understood the technology they had been up against. But by then, it was far too late. The story of the VT Fuze is a perfect example of how a single technological innovation, kept secret through cunning and discipline, can completely change the course of a battle. It wasn't just about the guns or the shells. It was about the tiny, brilliant device inside that turned a game of chance into a near certainty. It saved countless lives in London and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one your enemy doesn't even know exists. The miracle day, the 82% interception rate. In the summer of 1944, the V1 campaign was at its peak. Londoners lived in constant fear of the buzz bomb, or Doodlebug, as they nicknamed it. The initial defense was a combination of fighter planes and anti-aircraft guns positioned around London. But this had a major flaw. The fighter planes had to be careful not to fly into the friendly fire from the guns below, and the guns had to hold their fire when planes were in the area. This coordination was a nightmare and severely limited their effectiveness. Frustrated and with civilian morale plummeting, Allied High Command made a radical decision. They initiated Operation Diver, a massive logistical effort to move the entire anti-aircraft defense line. Over just a few days, hundreds of heavy anti-aircraft guns, along with their crews and all their equipment, were uprooted from the inland defense ring around London and redeployed to the coast. The new strategy was simple: create a gun belt along the English Channel to intercept the V1s as soon as they crossed into British airspace, far from populated areas. This move was a huge gamble. It left London temporarily more vulnerable and required immense coordination. But it set the stage for one of the most remarkable technological triumphs of the war. The guns were now in the perfect position. They just needed the right tool for the job. And that tool had just arrived from America. The secret weapon was a tiny, ingenious device called the Variable Time Fuse, or VT Fuze. To understand its genius, you have to know how traditional fuses worked. Old anti-aircraft shells used time fuses, which had to be manually set to explode at a certain altitude after a specific amount of time. If your calculation of the target's speed and altitude was even slightly off, the shell would explode harmlessly in empty sky. Hitting a small, fast-moving V1 this way was like trying to hit a fly with a single grain of sand thrown from 100 yards away. The VT Fuze changed the game completely. It was essentially a miniature radar set packed into the nose of a shell. This tiny device continuously emitted radio waves. When the shell got close to a target, the radio waves would bounce back and the fuse would detect this reflection. Once the reflected signal reached a certain strength, meaning the shell was within lethal range of the target, the fuse would automatically detonate the shell. It didn't need a direct hit. It just needed to get close. This turned every shell into a smart, proximity-triggered mine. But the VT Fuze was only one half of the equation. The other half was the equally revolutionary SCR-584 radar. This was an automatic tracking microwave radar system that could lock onto a target and feed its precise speed, altitude, and direction directly to an M9 gun director. The M9 was an analog computer that would then calculate the exact lead required and automatically aim the guns. So you had this perfect system. The SCR-584 radar would find and track the V1, the M9 computer would aim the guns, and the shells equipped with VT fuses would fly up and detonate automatically as soon as they got near the target. It was a complete, automated killing machine. The gun crews barely had to do anything but load the shells. This combination was about to be unleashed on the V1 South, crossing the channel. The climax of this story came on August 28, 1944. On this day, the Germans launched 101 V1 South towards England. Thanks to the new coastal gun belt, equipped with the -584 Seychelles rupees and the VT Fuze, the results were staggering. Of the 101 V1 South that were engaged by the guns, 83 were shot down. That's an 82% interception rate in a single day. Think about that. A weapon that had been terrorizing London for months was now being swatted out of the sky with almost routine efficiency. For the gun crews on the coast, it must have felt like a turkey shoot. The sky over the channel became a deadly wall of invisible traps. For the Germans, it was a complete shock. Their intelligence reports showed the launches were successful, but the bombs just weren't hitting London anymore. They never figured out why their wonder weapon had suddenly become so ineffective. They had no idea their V1 South were being destroyed by shells that could think for themselves. The statistics tell the whole story. In the early days of the V1 campaign, it took on average an astonishing 2,500 shells to shoot down a single V1. The sheer waste of ammunition was immense, and the success rate was dismal. After the coastal deployment and the widespread introduction of the VT Fuze, that number plummeted. What the Allies had created was, in effect, the world's first successful large-scale missile defense system. It was an anti-aircraft wall, stretching for miles along the coast. Any V1 that flew into the zone was entering a three-dimensional web of destruction. The SCR-584 radars would see it coming from miles away, lock on, and guide the guns. The shells would soar into the sky, not aimed at where the V1 was, but where it was going to be. And as they closed in, their tiny electronic brains would sense the target and detonate, filling the air with a cloud of deadly shrapnel. The V1 menace against London was effectively over, not because the Germans stopped launching them, but because they simply couldn't get through. This incredible achievement, born from American ingenuity and British determination, saved countless lives and remains one of the greatest unsung technological victories of World War II. It was a secret so well kept that the enemy never knew what hit them. The secret brain, the birth of the variable time VT Fuze. Let's rewind to the darkest days of the war. Cities across Britain were under constant threat from the V1, a pilotless jet-propelled cruise missile. They were fast, they were terrifying, and they were incredibly difficult to shoot down. Traditional anti-aircraft shells used timers. You had to guess the altitude and speed of the target, set the timer on the shell, and hope it exploded at the right moment. It was like trying to hit a speeding bullet with another bullet, blindfolded. The success rate was dismal, with gunners needing to fire thousands of rounds for a single kill. The morale in London was plummeting. They needed a miracle. And that miracle was being developed in secret, right under everyone's noses. It was codenamed the VT Fuze, and it was often called the Manhattan Project's silent brother. While the world's attention was on nuclear physics, a team of brilliant scientists and engineers at Johns Hopkins University were working on a different kind of game changer. Their mission, to build a miniature radio station that could be fired out of a cannon, Think about that for a second. This was the early 1940s. A radio was a bulky piece of furniture with fragile vacuum tubes. These scientists had to shrink all the components, a transmitter, a receiver, an amplifier, and a power source into a device no bigger than a milk bottle, and make it tough enough to survive the violent launch from an artillery gun. The forces involved were immense, over 20,000 times the force of gravity. Early tests were disastrous. The delicate glass vacuum tubes would shatter into dust upon firing. It seemed like an impossible task, but American ingenuity found a way. The team developed ruggedized vacuum tubes, designing them without the usual filaments and using clever shock-absorbing materials to cushion the delicate electronics. They created a special battery that was only activated by the spinning of the shell after it was fired, ensuring it was safe to handle but ready for action the moment it left the barrel. The result was a marvel of miniaturization, a true technological wonder years ahead of its time. So how did this secret brain work? The principle was brilliantly simple, yet revolutionary. It was called the proximity principle. Once fired, the VT Fuze would start emitting a continuous radio wave. As the shell flew through the air, this signal would just radiate out into space. But if it got close to a metal object, like an enemy aircraft, the radio waves would bounce back and be picked up by the fuse's receiver. The fuse was smart. It could detect the change in frequency of the returning signal, the Doppler effect, the same thing that makes a siren sound different as it moves towards you and then away. When the reflected signal reached a certain strength, it meant the shell was close enough to the target. At that precise moment, the fuse would trigger the explosive charge. The new motto for anti-aircraft gunners became, "Near enough is dead enough." No more guesswork, no more complex calculations. All they had to do was get the shell into the general vicinity of the V1, and the fuse would do the rest, creating a massive cloud of lethal shrapnel right where it would do the most damage. The impact was immediate and dramatic. In the summer of 1944, as V1 attacks on London reached their peak, the Allies deployed anti-aircraft batteries armed with VT fuses along the English coast. The results were astonishing. The kill rate for V1 South skyrocketed. Before the VT Fuze, gunners were lucky to shoot down 1 in 10. With the new fuses, that number climbed to 2, then 5, and eventually, on the last day of major V1 attacks against Britain, they shot down over 80% of the incoming buzz bombs. The Doodlebug menace was effectively neutralized. The skies over southern England became a graveyard for Hitler's vengeance weapons. The secrecy surrounding the VT Fuze was absolute. The Allies were so afraid of the technology falling into enemy hands that for a long time, its use was banned over land. They didn't want a dud shell to be recovered, analyzed, and copied by German scientists. They knew that if the Germans or Japanese developed their own version, it could be used against Allied bombers with devastating effect. The secret was guarded so tightly that most of the gunners using the fuses didn't even know how they worked. They were just told these new shells were magic. Finally, during the Battle of the Bulge, with the German army making a desperate push, the ban was lifted. General Patton's artillery unleashed a firestorm of proximity fuse shells on the advancing German troops. Unlike traditional shells that would bury themselves in the snow or mud before exploding, these shells detonated in the air, just above the treetops and foxholes. The effect was terrifying and incredibly lethal, raining shrapnel down on exposed infantry. German soldiers were stunned. They had no idea what was happening. They called it magic fire, and it played a crucial role in halting the German offensive. In the Pacific, the VT Fuze was equally decisive. It turned the U.S. Navy's anti-aircraft guns into an almost impenetrable shield against Japanese aircraft, especially the feared kamikaze pilots. Naval gunners who once struggled to hit these fast-moving, diving planes could now fill the sky with lethal explosions, creating a wall of steel that few could penetrate. Historians credit the VT Fuze with saving countless ships and lives, potentially shortening the war in the Pacific significantly. When the war ended and the full story came out, the VT Fuze was hailed as one of the most important technological innovations of the conflict, second only to the atomic bomb and radar. It was a testament to the power of science and engineering when focused on a critical problem. It was a tiny device that packed a massive punch, a secret weapon that flew under the radar and changed the course of World War II. It proved that sometimes, the biggest victories come from the smallest packages.